Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Imagine Live from Ericsson, where we take a close look at the future of limitless connectivity and invite you to share your thoughts live. Now, for those faithful viewers, you'll notice that I've got a different background today. We are testing Limitless. I'm broadcasting to you from Lugano, Switzerland today. Now, everybody has heard of the G20. Fewer people have heard of the B20, the Business 20, and we are planning to change that by zooming in on how the B20 influences the G20 through policy recommendations and the role of digital transformation in those actions. To help me with this, I am delighted to introduce two industry experts and two people close to the B20, Hans-Paul Bürkner, who is the Managing Director and Chairman Emeritus of the Boston Consulting Group, and co-chair of the B20's digitalization taskforce. Hans-Paul, you have been the co-chair at B20 Saudi, at B20 Italy, and now B20 Indonesia 2022. We are excited to learn from you today. How are you?
Very well, thank you very much. Actually, I've been involved for the last 10 years in the B20 because BCG has been a knowledge partner and supporter of the project management office for the last 10 B20 meetings.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm glad to have you on this program. You will definitely be able to give us some insight into what is going on behind the scenes. Joining you is Mikael Bäck, a member of Ericsson's Group Function Technology Leadership Team. And Mikael, you oversee the business priorities and the strategies for partnerships and customers at Ericsson, but you're also deputy co-chair of the B20's Digitalization Task Force. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Compared to Hans-Paul, I'm a newcomer, I guess. I've been only in this for 3 years now, so it's a bit closer for me. But it's been very interesting. It's been a very good process.
Well, I'm excited to dig into it. Already, we have viewers who are joining us from West Africa, India, the US, Iran, Romania. And let me tell our audience, welcome, how it's going to work. I'm going to be taking your questions live from Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and I will be feeding them into the broadcast. This is your forum, so please ask away. I'd like to start, though, with a question to you, Mikael. The obvious question, perhaps, what does the Business 20 or B20 do?
So B20 is formed as a working group under G20, that is the big political meeting that many people heard of. And B20 is gathering the business basically to recommend to G20 on important actions. And where we have been engaging is very much around digitalization, which is a key point, not the least the last years with the pandemic. So that is where we have been engaging. But the idea is actually to feed input from the business into the political meeting of G20.
How does it overlap, Hans-Paul? How does the B20 influence G20 decision-making? Are you meeting at the same time? Are there crossover fora that are happening between the global leaders and the business leaders?
Well, I think first I should add that besides the B20, there are also the L20 for labor, for unions and labor representatives, Y20 youth, W20 for women, T20 for research institutes and so forth. So there are lots of gathering besides the G20 who are actually feeding in to the G20 leadership meeting. Actually, the meetings are not in parallel. There will be an opportunity on Bali beginning of November to really meet together. In the past, actually, there was a meeting where the B20 and the other 20s provided their recommendations directly to the G20 leaders. Initially, maybe 10, 12 of those leaders were present when the policy paper and recommendations were handed over. That probably has dwindled over the years, and I think usually I would say is the leader of the G20. And this year it will be President Jokowi from Indonesia, who will receive the policy recommendations from the B20.
And how does it look in terms of the representation? Is it all large blue chip? Is it SMEs? Is it, one person startups? Who's invited to the table?
So if I start, it would be a mix. So it's typically big companies like us. It's consultants like Hans-Paul, but it's not the last this year where it's been a big focus on MSMEs and the smaller companies that we see as a very important target group for digitalization now. So there is representation basically from startups, from SMEs, from large enterprises, and other types of organizations. So it's a very broad mix, and I think that's been a successful recipe for the years I've been engaged.
Yeah, and the business organizations, whether it's small, mid-sized business, large corporations, the International Chamber of Commerce, and so forth. So they're all part of these activities.
Huh. And how do you recommend to the G20 anything that the B20 comes up with as a panel, as an organization? Hans-Paul, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Well, I think what we're having is besides the chair and the co-chair, there is a team supporting the chair and the co-chairs for the different task forces. We have actually several task forces for the B20. Mikael and I are part of the digitalization task force, but there's trade and investment, there is women, there is also on infrastructure investments and financing and so forth. And so there is a working team that regularly shares, the ideas, collects ideas and feedback from the whole group of 120 companies that are part of the digitization task force, and then translate this into a policy paper, which will come out shortly before the G20, B20 meeting in Bali.
I think
Mikael, yes, please.
I was just maybe going to comment that I think what has been obvious to me also is the role of digitalization, that we actually connect with almost all the other task forces. So if you look at sustainability, one of the biggest drivers that we can use is actually digitalization. It has a huge impact on future of jobs and other things. So I think it's been very clear to me that this is maybe not only one of the task forces, but it's really a foundation for many of the others as well.
I can imagine actually that as people have become more and more accelerated, shall we say, to the digital platforms, that the panels that you're hosting are more subscribed. And also across the board, people see digitalization as innovation, and therefore I'm sure they're very keen to get involved and put their voices in. Mikael, as Ericsson, how is your organization involved, and how do you benefit from it?
So for us, this came in very timely. So we were engaged, as I said, 3 years ago, where Börje was invited as co-chair for what was then hosted by Saudi. I was invited as deputy co-chair. And we started to work in a world where pandemic had not happened. So we started to plan for a normal year, and then the pandemic hit after 1 or 2 months. So it became a very interesting period at the same time as we as Ericsson started to transform our internal way of working. We saw the impact that digital was happening on overall society with 5G and a lot of other technologies. That immediately became the focus of B20 as well, much more than we had thought from the start, given the pandemic actually told everyone the importance of being able to work from everywhere, the importance for large companies, for industry transformation, for SMEs. So I think the pandemic and the connection with this actually moved digital up the chain to become a more important topic than it was when I started the very first meetings in our first B20 in Saudi.
Yeah, and it's not just, if I may add, it's not just about business, of course, the impact of connectivity, to schooling, to education, to healthcare, to government services, through the pandemic has been enormous. And so I think digitization has become, very much as Mikael has said, a very important catalyst for keeping society going in periods of lockdown.
Absolutely. I think we've definitely seen that. And I can imagine that around the table at the B20, you're coming up with different solutions for how to ensure that this then becomes something that affects and benefits everybody. I have a question here from Neha Arora A in India. Is it possible to create digital transformation by including people who may or may not have the financial means or the necessary know-how to benefit from digitalization? Hans-Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, obviously, devices have become very cheap. Mikael knows that much better than I, but I think, the opportunity to really cover the urban areas, the rural areas, with devices to really make sure that people can connect with each other. We will talk later on, I'm sure, about examples where farmers benefit from having the information and making better choices in what they're buying and when and what they are selling, and after harvest, for example. But I think the key is that connectivity has become very inexpensive, and the opportunity, therefore, to really include everybody has been massive. I mean, we've seen this in India, we have seen this in Africa, Latin America, especially in the emerging markets. And the emphasis in Jakarta or on Bali at the B20 will be to really have inclusive growth and to make sure that really everybody can benefit. In Indonesia, a country with thousands and thousands of islands where people feel maybe in the past disconnected, will show and demonstrate what is possible. So I think it's not a matter of having money, but it's about how do we spread the opportunities that we have and make sure that people really embrace the opportunity and how we enable them to make it work.
Yeah, and
Mikael, do you have anything to add on the idea of ensuring connectivity across the financial spectrum?
Yeah, so what I would say also, so the reason why cost is so low is that we've been able to keep a global standard with a scale that is higher than almost anything except agricultural products. If you look at billions of mobile phones and so on, it's really great that people in less developed countries can get the benefits of the investment that is taken by maybe US first or Japan or Western Europe. So I think all of this comes together in a way that really, really benefits developing markets, maybe even more than us. So this scale is really a key thing for us. And then, as Hans Paul said, we have seen from very long time back, even before the smartphones, how people are utilizing these services to get information about price. To education is a very clear area where high level education was not at all available in many parts of the world before we could start to use digital tools. And now we start to work with inclusion also when it comes to local languages, when it comes to illiterate people, we have to use other symbols and so on. So I think, to me, it's been a very, very useful tool for all categories of users.
I like to think of digital technology as something that shows us our boundaries as people, whether it's in society or whether it's assumptions that we make. And I think that certainly the idea of literacy is a really important area that we really are beginning to think about when it comes to reaching out and connecting. Hans Paul, there is a question here that I think that you can get your teeth into. It's from Catering Read in London. How can organizations raise awareness about the upcoming opportunities and improvising on skill sets for advancements of digital societies?
Well, I think today when, you have a question about how do you do this? How do you operate this device? How do you, solve a problem? The best thing is, you go on to one of the websites, platforms, or you ask, is there a YouTube video that shows you? And I think our kids are doing this. Maybe old guys like me are maybe not quite as skilled in that. But, I think people all over the world, especially the young ones, really know where to look and how to find out, and how to learn very quickly. So I think there is so much, drive, especially from the younger generation, to learn fast, to use the opportunities, that it comes automatically. And I think it's probably more up, for us to teach the older generations to make use of it, rather than to be afraid that the younger generations will not use it. They already do, and they know much more than certainly I know.
Have you seen anything, Hans Paul, that suggests a really interesting and innovative use of digital technology in business that you've used perhaps in discussing opportunities and innovations? Something perhaps that came out of left field or totally surprised you in your daily work and around the table at the B20?
Well, I think one of the things that I always find fascinating is, and Mikael already alluded to it at the beginning, that digitization or technology in general is so important for fighting climate change and bringing more sustainability. What we have seen is that, in very old industries like cement, refineries, steel plants, by combining people who really understand how to really use data, together with people who run the processes, who run the furnaces, who run the cement mills, the refineries, that they together find ways to reduce energy consumption, waste, leakage, who optimize the process, and then really run things much more efficiently with much lower emissions, and even, people who have been quite skeptical at the beginning, we think we have optimized everything. Is there still anything we can do? And you find out that there is lots of room for improvement. And I think this combination of great technology skills, data analytical skills, together with understanding the underlying processes, really is a fantastic recipe.
Yeah. Mikael, I'm going to jump over to you to answer that in just a moment. But before we do that, we talked briefly about this idea of universal connectivity, and we alluded to how important it is. But I'm wondering if you can give me a real kind of sense of the gravity of the necessity of universal connectivity and how you plan to communicate that back to the G20.
So what we are doing is what we talked about here. We're trying to describe many of the benefits in text and so on. But I think what we have learned over the years is it's more powerful if we can use examples from what we have seen or what other people have seen in transformation of industries, in schooling, in healthcare, in the way that logistics has been developing and utilizing these tools, the connection of electrification in the automotive and transportation industries is heavily connected to that you need to provide more information to trucks and cars and so on. So we have so many of these transformation that really builds on the power of digitalization, and then other things would happen on top of that. So I think one example we have done now in the use case library that we are developing together with B20 to really showcase examples is, for example, connecting a rural village would mean that you connect the people living there, but then that connection also becomes the platform from which you can build education, you can give access to healthcare, you can give access to information about pricing and whatever. So it really showcases also that this is not one of technologies of many. It's really the platform on which you then build other opportunities. We see a lot of things around how you're building safety, public safety things and so on. So it's to me, it's been a really good way to showcase that if you can build this universal platform of connectivity, it's so much more than connectivity. It's really a platform for so many other services to benefit from it.
Yeah. Can I just build on this?
What
because
is the progress, please?
In India, because Mikael emphasized, connecting people in the rural areas, in the villages, and in India, there are certain benefits. People are getting money for working days and so forth. And today, given that people almost all have, a mobile phone and they have a number, so the benefits are being paid directly rather than going through a pyramid of go-betweens, which are taking some of the benefits for themselves. So you really can reach, the beneficiaries directly by the government, everybody having his own account. And this really has made things, much, much more powerful and really reach those who are supposed to be the beneficiaries.
So this is the top line and this is the hope. You both have given some examples of where we're at right now, but Hans-Paul, what is the progress? How are we doing with universal connectivity?
I think we are making good progress. Of course, I can shower you with numbers. I'm sure Mikael can do that too. Talking about, how many people have a smartphone, how many people are working with the internet, how many companies are connected and so forth. But it's irrelevant because, the numbers are growing very fast. I think we see this, especially in countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and in so many small businesses, they only have an opportunity to reach customers and also to make good use of a wider net of suppliers by really using the internet. I talked to a woman in Ghana providing fashion, and she has 20 women in Ghana doing the knitting and so forth. And now with her fashion, which has become a big hit in certain countries in Europe, she can really reach people across the world. Now, of course, it also needs logistics companies, it needs payment services in order to make sure that the sale and of course really works. But it's there, and I think so. There's a huge wave, and we see this as a huge opportunity especially for people who have not been part of the global economy so far.
But I would
in
say
fact,
that another part we've seen
Mikael,
during the pandemic also is that this is no longer a question only for Africa and people outside Europe and US. I think we have seen an uptake also in inclusion of parts of US, Europe, and so on that wouldn't be perfectly included, like using mobile solutions to connect with branch offices of companies where fibers are no longer the perfect method to reach further out of the big cities. Education has been transformed completely also in more developed countries and so on. So to me, digital inclusion is less of this Africa, Asia, and Latin America only, but also really has been a tool to work with different parts of what we would see as the developed world. I think that's a big thing that has happened during the pandemic now, and I think that's usually will benefit a lot of companies, both in terms of which kind of solutions will be developed that maybe wouldn't have been developed otherwise, but also the way we can reach even more people in all parts of the world.
Yeah. But as you know, Mikael, of course, being in Indonesia this year, the emphasis has been very much on emerging markets. Next year will be India, and I'm sure also the Indian, leadership team will emphasize the importance of bringing everybody in the emerging markets into the fold. Absolutely.
And that was a little bit different in the years before with Saudi and Italy and so on that had slightly different focuses.
Yeah.
I'm going to push you on this. In fact, I'm not going to. It's going to be Stanley Aroyame, who's on LinkedIn. And Mikael, what is the plan and the timeline to get 5G around less developed countries?
So it's 5G is happening globally, but still a bit scattered. So if we look at the maps and so on, it's of course very well developed now. If you go to places like China, US, Korea, we're really early out. In Europe, we have a quite good coverage, but there is still more investment needed. And you have development in Middle East, you have developments in Africa and so on. So it will take longer time in some parts, but it's, as I said, the good thing is that the technology is really scalable. Therefore, the cost is really spread out over all these users. So it's starting to become a global standard, even though it will take a couple of years before we are fully rolled out in all these areas. But it's not so that many parts of the world will be left behind as we see right now. We are trying to support governments with tools, not only when it comes to financing, but also very practical things like how do you think about spectrum that you need for 5G? How do you think about access to infrastructure, towers, electricity, rights of way? So we're trying to use some of these best case examples to make sure that when more and more countries are coming along, you don't have to repeat maybe some of the mistakes that was done that took longer time in the first markets. So I think it will be quicker and quicker in my book.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Hans-Paul, if you can sort of back that up, the idea that there were mistakes in the rollout, and now people are really learning how to make sure that things get released to the most efficient way possible.
Every time we start something new, things are not perfect. So let's get used to that and don't try to point fingers because this mistake was made or that mistake. I think we've made very good progress. A lot of room for improvement, no question. But I would say every time we learn, and this is part of the experience curve that BCG also has fostered for many years and decades. Actually, is we do learn, and we do learn from our mistakes. And as Mikael has said, I think the rollout is happening quite well. And I'm sure, the next G will be even better,
Yeah. And I think one good
Looking
thing
forward to
working
that.
with
Yeah.
one good thing working with governments also in the G20 context is that we see, and especially after the pandemic, there is a lot of funding being made available from governments. In EU, you might remember that Ursula von der Leyen talked about this 20% of the 750 billion euros being available for digital. So in many countries, we have large funds being available. So we are also trying to talk to governments on in which way these funds actually would make most benefit. So I think there is an interesting phase also where there is funding from the normal commercial parties, it's from governments, it's from other sources. So it's a world that is also a little bit unlike what we've seen before in terms of how things are done and who is funding what and so on.
Well, that's a great launch pad to move into thinking about the future. And Hans Paul, I'm wondering if you could just give me an inkling about some of the recommendations this year and how they might be different from previous year's recommendations from the B20 to the G20.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, year by year, the scope of the recommendations is slightly changing. The emphasis is slightly changing, and that we are expanding. Now, in Germany, where the digitalization task force was established the very first time, the emphasis was on Industry 4.0. So really making industry much more efficient, much more, providing a digital transformation. In Saudi, the emphasis was very much on smart cities, given that, Saudi Arabia wants to build NEOM, the big city in the desert, which you may have heard, but also I think digitizing cities around the world. In Italy, again, I mean, we started being a bit more worried about issues like privacy and cybersecurity, which of course has also been a big topic today, given that so many institutions, private and government institutions, are being hacked and paralyzed. But I think, the key really is to make sure that we do let the many startups, the many businesses, the many big companies also really do a job and move forward and expand the possibilities for everybody, and making sure that we do not overregulate, but at the same time have enough protection where it's needed. So the emphasis is very much how can we make best use of technology, of digitization across the board, both in the government sector, but also in the private sector and civil society in general. And also addressing, of course, the anxieties of, AI and robotics replacing all of us, including consultants and moderators and so forth.
Yeah, our robot overlords are coming quickly, aren't they, Hans Paul? Mikael, I'm wondering from a business point of view, what needs to be implemented now so that widespread digitalization, as we are discussing and as we're imagining, does in fact happen in 10 years' time?
So I think there is a number of things that has to be done, and some is already done. But we actually see, as I said, very different pace of rollout of networks and so on. It might be practical reasons, it might be financial reasons, it might be regulations that is not working as they should. So I think what we are trying to do then as Ericsson as a company in B20 is to give our perspective, to try to bring our knowledge about the things that should be done in order to remove the hurdles that we have seen in deployment. They might be the same in many markets when it comes to you always need to finance, you always need to fix infrastructure and electricity, but they could also be different when it comes to education of the people that is supposed to roll out the networks, when it comes to local laws and regulations, taxes, when it comes to spectrum that is typically different in different countries. But I think from being in this business a long time, I think we actually have a huge bank of knowledge that we can use to make it easier and easier for every country rolling up now. And again, for them to make use of the full scale investment that is already taken by the early countries. So from that point of view, I think this business is completely different from when I started 30 years ago and volumes it was an exclusive, fairly expensive product and so on. We don't see much of that anymore.
Hans-Paul, Mikael talked about this from a business point of view, but we have a great question from Jessica Brass, which really taps into this idea of, you can bring this to the people, but if they're not ready, how do you ensure that this is adopted? I think this is a fantastic question. It's coming in from Facebook. She says, with improvised connectivity and as part of digital society, what are the steps that an individual can take for making technological advancements in day-to-day life?
Well, actually, I think people are, I would say most people are ready, maybe the older generations less so than the younger ones. I think put a device in people's hands, then they will make good use of it. I think it's really as simple as that. I mean, there are experiments by the Gates Foundations where they put, iPads or something similar at the doorstep of a school, and then children started, playing with it and making good use of it very quickly. I mean, the obvious challenge, and I think Mikael already alluded to it, is having electricity. So, I remember when I was talking to people in Nigeria, and not to pinpoint, point fingers at Nigeria, but he said, of course I have a device, I could build a business, my smartphone. The problem is electricity is really hard to get, and charging my smartphone is probably the biggest obstacle. So, I mean, Mikael rightly emphasized that it's not about just having towers, it's also having the electricity. And as we are, experiencing challenges in the energy markets around the world, I think energy is more important than ever. And probably, half the world population still has not access to reliable energy, lots of blackouts and brownouts, if there is at all energy. And in many rural areas, it's not the case. And I visited a school in India, in a rural area, a few months ago. Even though they had solar panels, they had also some laptops there. There was no electricity, no connectivity, literally, even though the material was there, but it was not, the equipment was there, but it was not, connected, and people did not have the power. So I think sometimes it's not the understanding that is missing, but it's really the basics, and energy is still important. You cannot do without energy.
And I think maybe just to comment on one important piece there on what happens in the world and will also benefit this part. That is that if you go back a number of years in time, we have made hardware equipment so much more efficient, also with software features, and so that you can turn off equipment when it's not used and so on. The efficiency of equipment that we want to have in all countries because of energy prices, but also more newer equipment becomes smaller, per definition easier to install and therefore consumes less energy. And for markets like Nigeria and so on, if you have a limitation, you want to run on solar panels, these aspects that would be super important in Sweden, that would be even more important if you have a scarcity of electricity. So I think, again, this world brings enormous opportunities when it comes to sharing the same development. And then the benefit might be a little bit different in different countries. Here it's electricity cost. There it might be being able to run the equipment at all and so on. But I think the global scale has really been useful for bringing technology to all people in the world.
Yeah, it is very, very easy to get ahead of ourselves. We have a really another really great question that reminds us that, again, if you build it, it's not necessary that people will come. And Hans-Paul, I'd like to ask you this one. We sort of globally have spoken about this idea of digital skills for the future, for the 21st century and beyond, and how each region has been trying to implement that in terms of curricula. How do we upskill people for jobs that we can't even imagine today? And Samit asks, learning new technology can be easy online. However, how do you recommend getting experience for those fresh out of school so that they're industry ready? Is there any focus on this in the B20?
Well, I think the B20, of course, has also emphasized the importance of skills training. But, if you want to be really practical, I think one of the key elements is to really start the training and the actual use of technology, in schools, elementary schools, secondary schools, and to make sure that the children in school, the pupils have really an opportunity to try out things, to do projects in school, maybe to, within their school, but also maybe with local government entities, with local private business, and making sure that there is an early application of real issues that people are dealing with. So in some schools, in Europe, they have close relationships with the business, with small shops and small businesses and so forth, where they can start learning. They do maybe apprenticeships. But I think the key is also to make sure that also the teachers are already skilled and know how to really coach their students. Very often the students are, even if they are only 10 or 12, are further advanced than the teachers. So I think what we all have to really engage on is to make sure that everybody at all stages, the young ones, the middle-aged and the old ones like me, are continuously really are open to the change, open to the opportunities, try out things, are not being afraid or saying, oh, I don't need this, I don't like it and so forth, but really embrace this and see the enormous opportunities to be better, to for people who are maybe handicapped, who are able to listen to podcasts rather than because they cannot read stuff, or because people who are handicapped and help them with logistics, how to best move from A to B and so forth. So I think we need to make sure that people see this as an enablement and not as a threat.
Yeah.
Mikael, I'm wondering from the point of view of business, how the types of skills that you're looking for, and how that is then communicated, not just up towards the G20, but then how that's communicated down back through the public and educational institutions.
So I would say that Ericsson is a very global company with a lot of employees in many countries. So we've been active for a very long time in many of these markets, where we are then typically engaged either through research and development and some of the advanced production of our equipment. But we also do a lot of cooperations with schools, with universities, with governments. Lately, it's been a lot of focus also on SMEs and the local communities, where you want to create innovation based on, for example, our technologies. I think it's not only Ericsson, of course. And one thing that we have seen working in many places is that we actually, to complement the way that people can use their smartphones with apps and so on, that you can do more or less without any other equipment personally. We also seen a use of, for example, local labs, where we do some more advanced equipment installation. Maybe there is a technician that can work with local innovators, local startups and so on, to teach them about how to also connect equipment to our networks that is not only the smartphone. So I think lately there has been a lot of focus on also including not only people, but also typically startups, local innovation, and a slightly wider use than the smartphones. And there we and other companies can maybe practically help more than just the B20 context. But that is something I've seen a lot of lately now, when you really want to create more jobs based on digital innovation. So I think there is so many things happening. I don't see any limits to what people will do with technology. I think Hans Paul and I for sure will not know all the examples. I think it's a lot of other people that will come up with this, not typically
Maybe
us.
I can give you also another example. I mean, BCG is working with schools, mostly in Europe, what we call business at school, where we work with groups of students to create businesses. And lots of these businesses are now, of course, startups, in the technology area. But I think it is not just BCG. I think many companies are involved, and many companies are doing this, of course, also to recruit good talent, but also I think in order to really help, the young people to get to know about the opportunities early on.
So I'd like to take a question now from Robert Cowan, who's in Italy. Within the business environment, there's so much innovation that's happening that it's almost impossible, I can imagine, as co-chairs of this task force to to really keep abreast of all of the innovations. And I'm wondering, from the group of people that you work with, that you consult with at the B20, and perhaps outside of that, how your thoughts on this. Robert Cowan from Italy says, what are your thoughts about blockchain, NFTs, and cryptocurrencies that are now being well received by digital societies across the world? And Hans Paul, I'll jump to you first.
Yeah, well, I would separate blockchain from cryptocurrencies. Blockchain, as an ledger system, I think will over time become very important, and we see some good applications, and hopefully also energy consumption will be much lower with the future systems. On crypto, I'm very skeptic, and I still look for people who can really persuade me that cryptocurrencies are the way of the future. So I have a very personal bias, I would say. And you also find in the financial world, and I've talked to a lot of people, very different opinions about this. So I think this is probably going a bit too far. And I think we have not made any recommendations yet from the B20 to the governments on more application of cryptocurrency. I think it's a very difficult topic.
And I think also
do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think B20 is also, it's not a government in terms of that it's lawmaking, it's not a regulator. So questions like exactly that is typically not handled. But I think B20 is, at least in my book, more used as a way to address some of these questions. Again, coming back to security, privacy, trust, some of these things that is really key to this, that will be the base for getting more and more people to dare to use this equipment, to really be able to explain some of the things that we have seen happening, to really make sure that technology can be used at best. So it's not, from that point of view, a regulator or a kind of government lawmaking body. So I think some of these questions would typically not be handled in B20 and G20, what I've seen.
Well, I want to finish up with a question that has come in from James in the UK. I think it's an optimistic one, and I think we can really we can look forward to hearing what your responses are to this. I'm going to first come to you, Hans Paul, for this. What would you say are the next businesses that will benefit the most in terms of revenue, profitability through early adoption of technology? And then, Mikael, I'll ask you the same question, but why?
Well, first of all, I would say all industries, all sectors, all companies, all individuals can and will potentially benefit from technology, from digitization. And I think, everybody, when you look at every element of, your company or your business, no matter how small, also the local farmers in India and so forth, can and do benefit enormously by really seeing, getting more and better information about where to buy, what to buy, at what price to buy, where to sell, what to sell, at what time to sell, and so forth, reaching out to more customers and so forth. So I would encourage everybody to really make good use of the applications, not necessarily spend 7 to 8 hours on your smartphone and surfing the social platforms, but really seeing, how can you learn more? How can you get more information that you may use in order to have a better, healthier life, to foster your training or your education and so forth? And I think, there will be endless opportunities, but people need to be open, but also people need to be selective at times in order to make the best use of their time.
Mikael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, you said that I should say why and how, I guess.
Yes,
so to me,
how much?
The benefit of this platform is global, but it will happen in slightly different ways. So in my book, when we started to look at this, of course, you were looking for efficiencies in manufacturing to make things more cost efficient or time efficient. So you have had very clear examples in manufacturing around predictive maintenance and so on, where we use technology. If you look at many other areas, it's access to information at the point of time you need it. That is the thing. It can be safety, it can be security. So for many of these cases, there is a fundamental thing on what you need to do. You need to have access to high quality, secure channel But then the way it will impact different businesses and people, society at large, will be done in different ways based on this common platform. So I think that's one of the cool things. We can really talk about one common investment you really do to drive this platform, and then you will have so many examples of what happens on top of that. That will happen together with local ecosystems, some of the legacy ecosystems you have that is completely different if you go to logistics or manufacturing or healthcare. But I think they will all benefit in one way or another, and fairly quickly. We see this happening now. Of course, some cases takes longer time, but it's really something that is happening now. So I support fully what Hans Paul said. This is the biggest opportunity I see right now in the businesses we look at. It's amazing to be in this part of the world.
Reduce emissions. I think we should not underestimate, how much, we can really address the climate change issue by really using data analytics and so forth. I get every month now my CO2 footprint, and, also my target where I have to be there, by the end of the year. So, it's, in many really very tangible steps, it makes life better, but we need to embrace it. We need to be open to the change.
And we need to educate, is my feeling. So when we talk to governments and so on, some of the messages I would bring around that this industry that may consume maybe 1.5% of the CO2 in the world can possibly impact industries consuming 15% of the CO2. These kind of messages is very different from that you have to close down digital to save some energy in the winter and so on. So I think we spend a lot of time, and we'll have to do so, on education, on not the least politicians and policymakers.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to stop this conversation right in the middle, but we have overrun. This has been a fantastic discussion. It's never lagged at any point. My thanks to both Hans Paul and Mikael, and to everybody who helped by sending in their questions and steering the conversation. Now, if you have enjoyed this broadcast, please do keep commenting and do keep sharing. The good news is that digital transformation is playing an increasingly important role in building sustainable economic growth. And that is why universal connectivity matters more today than ever before, and why the work of groups like the B20 is so vital. We hope that we have shone a light on that work today. Please do join us again in November for episode 6 in this series, when we will take a close look at the road from COP27 to net zero. See you then.